I recently finished this painting of this kitten here. For the most part, it wasn't that difficult, but there was definitely one section that was extremely difficult and it came close to making me go insane. And no, it wasn't the kitty. It was the leaves in the background. Hello and welcome. My name is Charlebos. I go by Bob and I'm not your typical painter. And in today's video, I'm going to show how I did the leaves in the background of this painting. The painting is just 11 by 14, so I did not have a lot of room to work with. That's probably one of the reasons why I had some difficulties. I also had to paint a lot of leaves. Before I show the demonstration, let me talk about the photo, which is this right here. This is a close-up of some of the leaves that I had to paint. One thing I want to point out is that I was trying to capture some of the ones that stood out more in the front and some that receded more into the darkness right here. In a way, I was trying to get a 3D effect. This here is a close-up of the very back. It is very blurry and it's something I wanted to keep from the photo. Why? Because the blurriness in the background will help make the leaves stand out in the front. Besides leaves that are alive, there were also dead ones. Yes, I had to paint dead leaves. But more importantly, the transition of dark to light would help push the leaves on the bottom back. But at the same time, I did not want this to stand out too much. I mean, the kitten is the star after all, not the fallen leaves. And lastly, this close-up of this plant right here is very crucial in establishing a sense of depth and distance. Think about it. These leaves are the closest to the viewer. They will complement pretty much the leaves in the background, especially since they are very tiny compared to the ones up close. Anyhow, this video will be broken down in 4 segments, with the first one being the underpainting that I did first. When doing the acrylic underpainting, my intent is not to be detailed, but instead to lay out a foundation of lines, shapes, and bodies of colors to act as a guide when I do the oil on top. That is why I used an alizarin crimson and vermilion dark tone to paint the area where the leaves will be, minus the small section where there's some light. Besides that, I painted some lines that represent the branches or vines for the leaves. This will be very helpful later to be able to paint the leaves directly onto them. I also painted some branches in the background that are thicker, as well as some key leaves that are on the darker tone because they are dry. Speaking of key leaves, I also start to paint specific ones, particularly a few that stand out. Nothing too detailed, they will just help guide me when I do the oil on top. To finish this area in acrylic, I applied my very dark tone to cover the areas that will definitely be in the shadows. This might not seem like much, but to me, this in a way is the drawing to my painting, and I used acrylic because it dries quickly and I can make corrections when needed thanks to the dry time. Now that I established the underpainting, which was very basic, now it is time to actually paint some leaves. Now that I'm using oil, I will definitely take advantage of the paint staying wet longer. The goal is to mostly focus on the leaves in the back first, and then slowly build the ones in the front while using the acrylic underpainting as a guide. Just like when I was using acrylic, I made a dark toned mixture with alizarin crimson and vermilion again. This is a very important color for me, especially since most of the leaves are in the dark. The strategy I used for the most part was to paint shapes that resembled leaves, with very cool dark tones of greens, and then use my dark mixture to paint around the leaves I made, and then dry brush the edges. I'm trying to create a sense of depth, so the leaves that are further into the back will significantly be less detailed and have softer blurry edges as well. It is very important that the leaves in the background have soft edges, especially the ones in the very dark. They will complement the ones that are more in the front to help establish that sense of depth and distance. I want to mention that I did not copy the photo of 100%, probably not even 25%, possibly not even 10%. But I did use it as a reference, especially for pattern and color. It would be kind of crazy to try to copy the photo 100% leaf for leaf. Something that is very helpful that I did try to copy from the photo are the vines. They are pretty much those lines I painted during the underpainting process. They are serving their purpose as a guide and making it easy for me to plot leaves. They are not set in stone, and here and there I make adjustments and corrections as well. If anything, you'll notice throughout the whole video, I'm constantly making corrections and adjustments, especially the leaves, whether it's reshaping them, making them brighter, or outright eliminating them. Besides painting the leaves on that bush or tree that's behind the bench, there were also fallen dead ones. In order to paint them, it was in a way a similar process that involved wet on wet painting. The big difference is the colors I used and also the shapes of the leaves. Since they are fallen, they are very dry and they are no longer green. They also became more fragile and in ways broken down into pieces. Like before, I did not copy the photo, but I used it as a reference to try to mimic the pattern. And I did not want it to be too much of a distraction, so I tried to give the fallen leaves soft edges and made them very blurry. But a very important thing I tried to establish is where the bush meets the ground. It is definitely very dark there, and I had to paint a transition from the bush to the ground, using my dark tone to create in a way a shadow. Also, besides dead leaves, there are some that are still green. They are probably the ones that have recently fallen. I do not want them to stand out too much, so the greens I use are not that bright and more muted. One reason why is because later I will paint some leaves that are going to be very close to the viewer, and I definitely want them to stand out and be very detailed. Which are these leaves right here. Right now I'm just laying out shapes and colors. In a way, I'm plotting where they will be in the painting. Why? Well, because I still have a lot of concrete I need to paint first, with lots of rough edges. After finishing the concrete texture, then I will go back and finalize the leaves. This makes sense because the leaves are definitely in front of the concrete. Anyways, let's speed through this section of painting the leaves in the background. So I continue painting leaves. One thing I'm doing differently for the ones that are brighter and closer to the viewing plane is that I'm adding a little bit more detail, which is a simple outline around the leaves and a leaf vein here and there on some of them, which is also just a line down the middle. Just like the leaves further in the back, I also dry brushed these as well. I do not want the detail to stand out too much, because in the end, the kitty is the star, of course. Speaking of dry brushing, I'm also repainting the vines in oil, but while the paint is still wet, I'm using my Viridian and Alizarin Crimson mixture and painting alongside the vines, making them not only thinner, but giving them a softer touch by blurring the edges. That way the vines are pushed back into the distance a little more and the leaves stand out more. There were also some leaves that were very faint in the back, but instead of being in the dark, they were in bright sunlight, and I tried making them as blurry as possible. This actually is a section that I finished a little later in the painting because I was not too satisfied early on. It just was not blurry enough, and I had to repaint the section again. Speaking of bright light, there were also some leaves that were very, very bright because they were also in direct sunlight, same as those blurry leaves I just talked about. Later, I would try to brighten them even more, but I will have to wait for the paint to dry to do that. To sum it up, the process is almost a tug-of-war battle. Create a leaf, possibly erase it, make it smaller, maybe make it more detailed, and then play with the edges. Some soft, some hard, but I keep in mind there are limitations to working wet on wet. So, that is why later I will go back when the paint is dry. Now it is time to paint the plant that is up close. Now these leaves are very important to the painting. Since they are very close to the viewer, they have to be the most detailed. Therefore, I spent more time detailing these leaves versus the ones in the back. It was also quite a challenge. They were definitely in front of the dead leaves, but also part of the concrete. I knew fully well that I would have to return to this section later, but that did not stop me from getting an early start. The process was similar at first, where I build simple shapes of color, but the shapes would be more intricate, and depending on the shape and contour of the leaves, I will use different tones of lights and darks to shape them out. I also painted a vine that stretched across the concrete. Then I would paint leaves on it. I tried to follow the photo more carefully in this section because I wanted these leaves to stand out more. Also, to make them pop out even more, I made sure that the backdrop where the leaves were was a bit more darker than the photo and also blurrier. As for painting the leaves themselves, I took advantage of the paint being wet to create soft transitions from one color to the other. When painting a leaf, It's good to establish the shape with one color, but then you have to look very carefully to see how it reacts to light and shadows as well. And it is easier to create those transitions from one tone to the other while the paint is still wet by simply just applying the colors you see and then gently dry brushing. Then there's also the veins of the leaves. You do not want them to be too sharp, but very subtle. That is why it is important at this stage to paint them. That way you could dry brush them lightly if they stand out too much. One of the leaves also had a fold. I applied my very dark tone underneath it and also brightened the edge. That way that fold stands out. But the most interesting leaf was the one that was circular in shape. I used different tones of green, lights and darks, to give it its shape. And unlike the soft transition of one color to the other, I left one of the edges very sharp to help establish the form of the leaf. And to create a sense of depth, I used my dark tone to soften the edges of the leaves that protruded next to the concrete. I wanted to give them the illusion that they emerged from the ground, plus to make the upper parts of the leaves stand out more. Speaking of the concrete, I began working on the texture. I knew later I would go back into the leaves, so now was a perfect opportunity to give the concrete a nice rough look, plus to paint the shadow that the kitty and also the bench casted. But the other reason was to soften some of the edges of where the leaves met the concrete. Again, this is to make certain parts of the leaves stand out more and for other parts to recede, and using soft and hard edges at the right places helps. Now time to speed through this section. You will notice at one point that I stopped actually working on the leaves and focus on the concrete even more. That is why I want to stress the importance of layering and to properly pick what you work on first and then work on later. In this scenario, I work on both the leaves and the concrete, but I keep in mind that I will go back into the leaves to make them stand out even more. Speaking of texture, there's a difference of how I treated the concrete in the back. It is intentionally softer and more blurry to make the section closer to the viewer stand out even more. I'm also taking advantage of the paint being wet, both the concrete and the leaves, to further soften and push back some of the leaves that are more in the back, particularly the ones on the vine. All this to create a sense of depth and distance, even for a few feet. At this stage, the painting is almost complete, but I still have final touches to do, which is the last part. Starting with this area here. My first order of business was to start from the back and work my way to the front again. I wanted to make the section in the very back as blurry as possible. In the way, this is the reverse from emerging from darkness. Instead, I want to create the illusion that these leaves are emerging from the bright light in the back. In a way, I almost redid this section because I was not too happy how it looked. This also gave me the opportunity to fix some of the vines and branches in the back. They originally lacked some sense of volume, so I added some lights and darks to give them a sense of shape. I wasn't going too detailed because they are definitely in the back and I did not want them to stand out too much, but at the same time, for them to have a sense of volume. Besides the branches and vines, the dead leaves in the back were also similar in color, so I started to paint additional leaves that were more brown and neutral instead of green. As for the rest of the leaves, I scrutinized the painting and went back into select ones, which ended up being quite a few. At this point, I was using the photo a lot less. My main focus was to create a sense of depth. In order to do that, I went back and softened some edges and used some brighter tones for some of the leaves that were in direct sunlight. I even used pure cadmium yellow for some of the bright spots, but I did not just focus on the bright light. I wanted to include some of the cool tones I saw in the photo, so I went back to key leaves and repainted them with some tones that were definitely on the cooler side. And to create more atmospheric depth, I used my dark tone once again and repainted certain sections that looked very pitch black. This also gave me the opportunity to rework some of the leaves and even create a few new ones, especially since the paint is wet again. I also started to pay attention to scale and in ways adjusted some of the sizes of the leaves, either making them larger or smaller. But the ones on the very bottom that met with the ground were definitely the smallest. I also repainted that section with my dark tone again and made the leaves barely visible by not only softening the edges, but using very cool tones of green on the darker side to make them barely visible. That way the leaves on the top stand out more, all to further help establish a sense of depth. I continued to also rework some of the leaves that have fallen, both the ones that are dead and also the ones that are still a bit green. Even though I introduced some brighter greens, the goal was to make sure that they do not stand out too much. I wanted to create a sense of variation among the leaves on the ground, some freshly fallen and some that are dried up and dead. Now time for the final touches. At this stage, I believe I was 99% done with the concrete, so I wanted to enhance the leaves that were in front of it. I did everything from introducing more colors to give certain leaves a better sense of shape and volume, and I reworked some of the edges, both the soft and hard ones. To me, these leaves are very important. The painting is only 11 by 14 inches, so I do not have a lot of room to work with, but I know that the more detailed that they are, the better they will complement the leaves in the back, especially at establishing a sense of depth and distance. And since the leaves are dry right now, adding certain sharp details is a lot easier. The ones I definitely sought out in improving the most were the ones attached to the vine. I felt that they were too blurry and they blended a little bit too much with the concrete, so I definitely tried to make them more opaque and less translucent. Plus, I wanted to give the vine a little bit of volume too, so I worked in some lights and darks to give it the appearance that it is like a cylinder and not just a flat line that connects the leaves. Yes, a lot went into making these leaves, but in the end, they were just a small part of the painting, but necessary. They helped establish scale with the big leaves in the front and even a sense of depth and distance. But in the end, you know who was the star of the painting? Gus, of course. If you made it to the end, thanks for watching. I truly appreciate it, and I hope you found this video helpful. For more of my work, check out my Instagram. Not your typical painter, of course. Anyhow, until next time, bye for now.